Introduction: The 800-Year Survival Gap. A pale mist drifts through Sherwood Forest. Ancient trees rise like pillars, swallowing every sound. Then the scene shifts, modern day, where a hiker stares at a smartphone, flashing two words that mean trouble. No signal. It is June 14th, 1209. Hugh the Scot has just killed a royal deer. Under Norman forest law, that isn't a crime, it's a death sentence. Within hours, foresters and tracking dogs sweep through 100,000 acres, hunting him down. But Hugh disappears into the greenwood. For 30 days he lives, sleeps, and moves through this forest as if it were a second skin. And when the manhunt fades, he calmly walks into a church and claims sanctuary, alive and unharmed. 800 years later, in October 2023, a fully equipped hiker enters the same forest with GPS, a phone, high-tech boots, and a premium survival kit. Yet in just 18 hours, he is lost, hypothermic, and calling for rescue, despite temperatures that never even fell below freezing. How can the same landscape sustain a medieval outlaw for decades, while a modern prepper struggles to survive a single day? Today on Historia Prime, we're not asking who was tougher. We're revealing a survival system so advanced it functioned like an invisible fortress, a blend of mindset, biology, and environmental mastery that even modern strategists struggle to match. We'll explore the stay versus return mentality, the layered defenses built into the medieval forest, and the ancient resilience our comfortable world has quietly erased. Because the outlaw didn't visit the woods, he became part of them. And by the end of this episode, you may begin to see the forest, not as a place to escape from, but as a place you could survive in. Are you ready to learn the unwritten rules of the Greenwood? Let's begin. The Secrets of the Disinherited. Part 1. The Wolf's Head and the Law of the Jungle. To understand how medieval outlaws survived for decades, we need to enter a world where the forest wasn't a retreat. It was the last refuge of the condemned. In the 13th century, becoming an outlaw was never heroic. It was pure survival. Under the unforgiving Norman forest law, a man cast from society was declared a wolf's head, meaning he held the same legal value as a wolf. Anyone could kill him on sight, without consequence, without question. These forests, especially in counties like Nottinghamshire, weren't wilderness open to all. They were the king's private hunting grounds, covering nearly a fifth of the land. And if a starving father dared snare a deer to keep his children alive, he could lose his eyes, or his hands. Mercy was rare, punishment was certain. Yet men like Roger Godberd, the true figure behind the Robin Hood legend, survived under these conditions for decades. Every snapped twig could start a chase. Every shadow could hide a forester, and still they endured. The reason is simple but profound. To the outlaw, the forest wasn't a playground. It wasn't scenery. It was a strategic fortress. Modern preppers often step into the wild, hoping to beat it with gear and gadgets. But the outlaw understood something far older, that survival comes not from conquering the environment, but from belonging to it. This is the first rule of the disinherited. The forest won't protect you until you treat it as home. Once you accept that, the invisible fortress begins to reveal its secrets. Part 2. Layer 1. The Art of Visual Integration. To survive long-term in a medieval forest, the first skill an outlaw mastered was not fighting, hunting, or shelter building. It was disappearing. Modern preppers buy digital camo, thermal jackets and gear patterned after military design. But medieval outlaws didn't blend in with science, they blended in with understanding. They practiced visual integration, merging themselves into the forest so completely that even trained foresters could walk past them without noticing a thing. Medieval hunting manuals, like L'Art de Vénérie, advised something beautifully simple. Wear green in summer and grey in winter. Not because it looked tactical, but because it matched the shifting palette of bark, moss, and shadow. They weren't dressing for style, they were dressing for survival. And while modern hikers fear losing the trail, outlaws feared something far more dangerous: the trained noses of tracking dogs. They knew they couldn't outrun them, so they learned to break their scent the only reliable way: moving through running water. Streams, shallow creeks, even wet marshes became escape routes. It's a technique still used today by people who must not be found. But perhaps the most surprising secret of all was their mastery of silence. Outlaws often moved barefoot or in soft wool hose. Leather soles snap twigs, they slap against roots. They echo through dry leaves that explode like drums under the weight of modern hiking boots. But bare feet give you ground feeling, a sensitivity to pressure, weight, and rhythm that lets you float across the forest floor without a sound. Silence to an outlaw wasn't a skill, it was armor. So ask yourself, if your survival depended on not being heard, if one missed step meant death, would you trade your $300 boots for the quiet safety of your own bare feet? Because the outlaw did, and that choice helped them vanish into a world where sound itself became a weapon, or a warning. Now that we understand the power of becoming invisible, let's move deeper into the invisible fortress. Part 3. Layer 2. Terrain as a weapon. If camouflage allowed the outlaw to disappear, then terrain allowed him to take command of the forest itself. Modern hikers follow marked trails, trusting signs, GPS lines, and cleared pathways. Medieval outlaws did the opposite. They practiced what we now call trackless movement, a way of traveling so fluid, so unpredictable, that no tracker could reliably follow it. To them, the forest wasn't an obstacle. It was a fortress with shifting walls. They mastered terrain masking, using the land's natural chaos as a shield. Dense undergrowth, tangled thorns, and deep marshes became barriers that no sheriff's horse could pass. A mounted patrol might have speed on the open road, but inside the greenwood, a single fallen oak could slow an entire pursuit to a crawl. Outlaws slipped through these zones effortlessly, knowing exactly where the ground dipped, where the roots twisted, and where the mud swallowed boots whole. They also controlled natural choke points. Every stream crossing, every narrow game trail, every toppled log was a place where movement could be predicted and ambushed. A single outlaw with a crossbow, hidden in shadow, could stop a dozen men who had no choice but to funnel through tight terrain. The forest didn't just hide them, it fought for them. And then there was the vertical advantage. Outlaws lived on the ridgelines. From high ground, they could watch smoke from cooking fires, hear the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, and see foresters maneuver miles away. Today, even with helicopters, drones, and thermal imaging, it still takes search teams an average of 14 hours to locate a lost hiker. Medieval sheriffs had none of that, yet the outlaws evaded them for decades because they knew every ridge, every hollow trunk, every cave hidden beneath a veil of ivy. This is the power of terrain when understood, not as a backdrop, but as a weapon. And the lesson for us is clear. The one who knows the land isn't just surviving in it, they are shaping the battlefield itself. Part 4. Layer 3. Supply independence and the three-tier system. If camouflage made the outlaw invisible and terrain turned the forest into a fortress, then this next layer reveals how they survived for not just days, but decades. Modern survival thinking often repeats the same mantra: carry more gear to increase capability. But medieval outlaws lived by a different code: increase your knowledge until gear becomes optional. And that single shift changed everything. Their first mastery was water. While we depend on filters, tablets, and metal bottles, outlaws carried something far more valuable: a mental map of every spring, seep, and clean-running stream across miles of forest. They didn't search for water, they remembered it. Their landscape literacy was so deep that they could navigate by taste, temperature, and the sound of flow beneath the soil. Next came renewable logistics. Modern preppers pack high-calorie rations and MREs, but once those run out, many are helpless. Medieval outlaws couldn't afford that weakness. They built systems that regenerated themselves. They made plant fiber snares, deadfall traps, and primitive lures to hunt the very deer that had condemned them to outlawry in the first place. Their food wasn't in a backpack. It was in the ecosystem they understood intimately. And when the weather turned, they didn't reach for a 4-kilogram tent. They reached for bark, moss, and branches. In under 2 hours, they could build a debris hut warm enough and weatherproof enough to survive storms that would overwhelm a modern nylon shelter. Their home wasn't something they carried, it was something they could create on command. All of this worked because outlaws operated under a simple but powerful 3-tier survival system. Tier 1 was the ruck, the bag you hope to keep. Tier 2 was the belt kit, the tools you keep on your body. And Tier 3, the most important of all, was what lived in the mind. If the outlaw lost his bag, he still had his belt. If he lost his belt, he still had his knowledge. That final tier is the one modern preppers often forget, and it is the reason medieval outlaws could be stripped of everything, yet still survive another 30 years. Knowledge, not equipment, was their true supply line, and it never ran out. Part 5. Biological hardness. The making of the hardened human. To understand why medieval outlaws could live in the forest for decades, we must confront a truth modern society often forgets. The human body of the past was not the body we carry today. We picture medieval peasants as frail, malnourished, worn down by toil. But archaeologists paint a very different image, one of extraordinary physical resilience. These men and women were, in many ways, biomechanical machines, shaped by a lifetime of unbroken labor and exposure. Their bones tell the first story. Excavations of medieval longbowmen reveal arm bones so dense, so heavily reinforced, that they resemble the stress patterns of professional athletes. Many longbowmen developed elongated right arms from pulling war bows with draw weights that would tear a modern shoulder apart. Even common laborers, farmers, woodcutters, masons, carried skeletons strengthened by daily strain we would now consider extreme training. But bone was only one part of their biological armor. Their immune systems operated like furnaces. While we live insulated in sanitized environments, medieval people were, quite literally, wedded to the soil. From birth, they inhaled dust rich with microbes, touched unfiltered water, handled animals, and lived among bacteria that would overwhelm many of us within hours. By the time they reached adulthood, if they reached it, they carried immune systems capable of neutralizing pathogens that routinely incapacitate modern urbanites. Their resilience wasn't optional, it was survival. And then there was their core strength. Medieval life demanded constant movement. It was normal for people to walk 20 or 30 miles a day while carrying tools, bundles of wood, or food. This wasn't exercise, it wasn't training, it was simply how life worked. What we now call endurance athletics was for them a Tuesday. All of this created an outlaw who needed less food, recovered faster, tolerated cold more easily, and could push through exhaustion that would cripple many today. It meant their baseline, the state they woke up in every morning, was a level of fitness modern preppers often try to simulate but rarely achieve. This biological hardness wasn't heroic. It wasn't glamorous. It was the byproduct of a world that demanded strength just to exist. And in the Greenwood, it became one of the outlaws' greatest weapons. Not forged in iron or oak, but in muscle, bone, and the unbreakable conditioning of a life lived close to the earth. Part 6. The failure of technology, the GPS trap. To understand why modern preppers often fail where medieval outlaws thrived, we must confront one of the greatest paradoxes of our age. Technology, the very thing we believe keeps us safe, often blinds us instead. It creates what survival experts call a decoupling of perception. In other words, we stop seeing the world with our own senses and start outsourcing our awareness to devices that can vanish in an instant. The modern wanderer steps into the forest armed with GPS. Yet the moment the canopy thickens, or the battery drains, or the signal flickers out, panic begins to rise. When the glowing screen goes dark, many people experience the same reaction: panic walking. It's a frantic, disoriented movement driven by fear rather than logic, and it leads directly to the most common causes of wilderness death: falling into ravines, slipping into rivers, collapsing from exhaustion. But medieval outlaws did not have the luxury of panic. They could not afford it. Their navigation was rooted in perception, not devices. They read the forest as if it were a living manual. The position of the sun told them time. The pull of the wind whispered direction. The growth of moss revealed moisture and shade. Even the silence of birds carried meaning. A sudden stop in birdsong wasn't just eerie. It was an alarm, a natural signal that something large, human, and dangerous was moving through the trees. Where modern preppers stare at screens, medieval outlaws watched the world. They listened to it. They responded to it. Technology may guide us, but it also dulls us, creating a fragile dependence. For the outlaw, awareness was their GPS. Their senses were their survival tool. Their environment was their map. And that is why, when the modern device fails, the modern human falters. While the medieval outlaw simply kept walking, guided not by electronics, but by an ancient dialogue with the land itself. With this final layer revealed, we begin to see the greenwood not as a hostile labyrinth, but as a system one the outlaw understood intuitively, and one we are only now starting to rediscover. Conclusion: learning to stay. In the end, the deepest difference between the medieval outlaw and the modern prepper isn't strength or gear or even skill. It's mindset. Today, most people enter the forest as visitors. We see it as a playground, a challenge, a landscape to conquer for a weekend before returning to comfort. But for men like Roger Godber, the forest wasn't a test. It wasn't a backdrop. It was a home, a fortress, a world he belonged to completely. This is the divide between what we might call the return mindset and the stay mindset. The modern prepper waits for help. They count the hours until rescue, measuring their survival by how long they can hold out. But the outlaw didn't wait. He built systems. He carved out a routine. He created a microeconomy within the forest itself. He stayed. And that reveals the lesson we must carry forward. True resilience does not come from the gear in your backpack. It comes from integration, your ability to read the land, respond to its signals, and understand the forest as a living manual, written in shadows, in silence, and in the subtle messages of wind, birds, and terrain. This is environmental literacy, and it is a skill set far older and far more valuable than any tool you can buy. As our world grows more unpredictable, these ancient abilities stop being curiosities of history and start becoming a blueprint for the future. So the next time you step into the woods, try something simple. Leave the GPS in your pocket for a while. Listen to the wind, watch the trees, notice the patterns you've never seen before, and quietly ask yourself a question that medieval outlaws answered every single day. If I had to live here for 30 years with nothing but a knife, where would I begin? Thank you for watching Historia Prime. If you want to explore the lives of the disinherited even further, I invite you to watch our deep dive into Roger Godber, the man behind the legend. Stay hidden, stay safe, and above all, keep learning.